Good evening. Back again on one of the rare night filmings here with MB Zucker, writer, podcaster, Juris Doctor. I have a history question that might be good to start with if you're willing. That would be if you could have a meal with 5 people. They could be that are dead or alive. They're not going to be dead for the meal. They'll be alive for the meal, but they could be people in history or people alive today. Language is not an issue, so everybody would understand each other. What do you think? 5 people. Who you got?
Sure, it is an interesting one. Definitely Eisenhower, who was sort of my, the historical figure I was interested in the longest and was the subject of one of my earlier novels. So Eisenhower, probably Tolstoy, who's a favorite writer of mine. Um, say T.E. Lawrence of Arabia.
Ah,
Um, do John Quincy Adams, who's the subject of the last book I did, and then maybe Hemingway.
rounding it out. It's good. I think I saw your podcast that talked about Lawrence of Arabia, the film, but we'll talk about podcasting. So, historical fiction seems like that's what you would call yourself right now, first and foremost, a historical fiction writer. Is that true assessment?
Yeah,
Why
that's correct.
why historical fiction?
Well, I'd always had a strong interest in just stories and storytelling. Like when I was like 7 or so, I was writing I mean, not like literal books, but like kind of stories about, let's say, dinosaurs or something over several pages and then stapling that together and sort of saying, thinking of it as a book. I mean, I probably wrote like 30 of those or so when I was around 7 or 8. Um,
Wow.
and so that was an early interest. And then when I was around 15, um, learning about World War II for the first time, that interest sort of just mapped on to history in that war as like just sort of like there's this huge story of kind of good and evil and that sort of thing. And then that sort of just kicked off my overall interest in history, starting with Eisenhower, who's that's why he was the first person I picked. And then those two interests, both of storytelling and history, just sort of instantly merged together and became just a general interest in historical fiction. And that's pretty much been my main interest ever since.
How do you approach the historical fiction angle? Are you looking to make it weave into history so it's somebody's going to read it and think, is this all what happened? Is this all true? Or is it more of adding a little more spice to it than maybe history had? What's your approach for the final product?
I guess it's a little different with each project. I mean, overall, I'd call it kind of like a balancing act. I think you want definitely like the majority of it to be, as accurate as you can get it. Um, Especially when you're approaching, you're doing a kind of like a fictionalized or dramatized version of real events, which is the bulk of what I've been doing recently. Um, I mean, I think there are certain places either where like there's just information that's not known, or um, yeah, that's usually the main place where you would kind of like be able to fictionalize certain details, whether it be like a what a person was thinking, or if like there's different like conflicting accounts about events. Which there's a good example I can mention for the John Quincy Adams novel um, about that. Um, so I think those type of things are normally where I kind of give myself a little more liberty, and then usually at the end there'll be some sort of author's note that kind of will break down, all right, so this is how I approached it, and whatever sort of large liberties that were taken, sort of detail them and kind of explain why those decisions were made.
Yeah, I imagine with people like John Adams, that John Quincy. Okay, so that's the second Adams. You probably have
Yeah.
a lot of correspondences from him to other people that you can look at to maybe get some insight, at least to what he told other people. I know his dad had all those letters and everything with his wife and Jefferson, but I wonder if John Quincy has the same type of stores of letters.
There were letters, but even more than that, he kept a diary from when he was 12 through the end of his life. It was 51 volumes long. And thankfully, the Massachusetts Historical Society both digitized it and built in a search engine to sort of navigate it. And so that was just invaluable with this novel, being able to sort of search through the period of his life that I was focusing on when he was Secretary of State, and being able to sort of look for exactly like, you know, how he approached either the annexation of Florida or the showdown with Europe or his election against Jackson or anything like that.
Huh. Any big insights that you didn't learn in school that you were like, hey, how come this wasn't taught in history?
Well, I think this entire period gets either overlooked or just like summarized very simply. I mean, it's so he's Secretary of State to President James Monroe, and that sort of was nicknamed the era of good feelings because we had just ended the War of 1812. The entire Napoleonic period that had sort of dominated the first four presidencies of American history was over. So there was sort of peace in the Atlantic world, and also the Federalist Party that Alexander Hamilton had created was largely disintegrating at this point. So there wasn't even much partisanship domestically. And so between those two things, this was kind of like it's viewed as this kind of rare sort of calm point within American history. But what was interesting to me was finding all of the crises that were going on that, even as somebody who'd been interested in history since I was 15, so that's, had been, at the time, it had been 12 years since then, and reading history pretty consistently through that period. Not, I hadn't heard about any of them. Um, the biggest one being this sort of showdown that he has with Europe over South America's independence that led to the Monroe Doctrine, and
Mm,
this, what I would describe as a diplomatic chess match he was in with this Austrian diplomat named Prince Clemens von Metternich, who most Americans probably haven't heard of, but Europeans might know him as one of the architects of Napoleon's downfall, and then
huh.
as sort of the main figure involved at the Congress of Vienna and the Concert of Europe, which helped to keep the peace within, or at least avoid a war of that scale within Europe for about 100 years until World War One broke out.
Okay.
So, a real sort of master diplomat, probably one of the greatest in European history. Adams is usually ranked as our best Secretary of State, and so that you had this sort of chess match between the two that led to, probably the most famous foreign policy document in our history. I thought it was an interesting story, and the fact that it's like it seems so little known. I thought, would make a good novel. So that's the main conflict that the book deals with, and then there's a couple of other ones, including um, sort of Adams taking advantage of the Spanish Empire's collapse in order to both annex Florida as well as a chunk of territory in what we would now call the Pacific Northwest.
Mm,
So our claim to like Oregon and Washington State in that region,
right.
and a couple of others, including that deals with like slavery and the rise of Andrew Jackson and things like that.
I grew up in Virginia, and I think you're in Virginia now. I'm in Florida now, so that's interesting. The the history that we got a lot of presidential history growing up just because Virginia had so many presidents. And I remember the learning about that the era of good feeling and the Monroe Doctrine. I don't remember the name of that other guy you were talking about, the Von whoever. It would be a good name for a dog, though. That sounds like a classic name for a dog. And it's interesting how it felt like maybe through elementary school to middle school, you kept getting the same thing over and over again each year in history. You got Jamestown, all that stuff, and then up through the presidents and maybe to World War One. You never really got far beyond World War One in U.S. history there. But was that your experience in that in grade school, or did you go to school in a different state?
So I grew up in Arizona. Um,
Mm.
I don't remember much of whatever history was taught before like middle school. I think maybe we did some like early colonial history or something to that effect. I think middle school was sort of the first like, you know, actual overview of like most American history. Um, the way that my school did it was kind of interesting. I think like when I was around 13 or so, they did like the Civil War through maybe World War One, and then they did the Revolution through, near the Civil War, and then jumped forward from like World War Two to the present. Not entirely sure why it was designed that way, but that was sort of the initial introduction. Um, and yes, I think to whatever extent this period was really discussed, it was like very briefly just mentioned that like, it was called the era of good feelings because it was just reasonably stable, but there was a recession in 1819.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and maybe the Missouri crisis was mentioned, which is another major event of the book when Missouri applied for statehood as a slave state, and that almost triggered a civil war in this period.
Oh, okay. I don't know much about that. I'll have to check that out. The When you're writing it to keep it all straight, do you use like a big timeline that you write out everything so you can see it kind of what else is going on in the world during the time that you're writing about, or how do you weave it into history with
Um,
everything at once?
I'll usually build just sort of like a master document of like an outline, and we'll just kind of like, it's like bullet points upon bullet points, but we'll just sort of mention like, these are events that are can just be like mentioned that this is what's going on in the world. Like he meets the Spanish diplomat is a major sort of antagonist in the first half of the book as he's negotiating, for the annexation of Florida primarily. And in one of their meetings, it's mentioned that King George III has died, and they just kind of comment on how that'll affect what's going on in the world. So like that type of thing. It's like it's not like a huge moment for Adam specifically, but just kind of mentioning like, this world event has just happened.
Yeah, I don't remember growing up ever in those grade school history classes ever being like putting together the timeline of Napoleon and the US, like what was going on at the same time. And it wasn't until college or after or just reading on my own that I started to put that together and go, oh, Napoleon is a kind of a contemporary. The revolutions were going on at relatively the same time. And that gives a little more of the impetus of why France would have been willing to kind of stick it to England and help America. So I taught a law enforcement history of law enforcement class at University of Phoenix in Virginia Beach some years ago. They had a brick and mortar building there, and putting together all those things that happened in the early 1900s, that you just how policing was changing, but then you put it against the backdrop of prohibition and all the wars. You do a timeline and put all the wars in there, and it for me it changed my view of being able to understand history a little better, where you can go all the way, World War One, World War Two, yeah, but go back to the Revolution, Civil War, all that time frame, and then use that as your base for overlaying all the other history. And it gave I just wonder why I never had a history class that taught like that, because it made it so much clearer to see. And then you back out even farther from that and look at world events that are going on at the same time. I started writing a historical fiction that happens between like 1775 to 1815. and it takes place from Africa to South America to North America. And putting that timeline together, I felt like I learned more about history than I had, more world history maybe than I had learned in regular grade school. And then once you get to high school, it kind of, I don't remember the history classes so much, but do you ever, how do you keep that all together just outside the outline, but bringing in pieces of the world history to your writing? Are you trying to stay focused on these views or bring in other things for the reader to consider? Or is it mainly just for your own knowledge of saying, I know what's going on this time, so maybe you get a little more insight into the people's minds, whether it is what they were thinking, but maybe at least it was on their mind?
Um, well, whatever like the starting point is, as far as like you're just finding John Quincy Adams seems to be an interesting character, reading a bit about him, and then learning of this sort of this showdown with Metternich, who was that Austrian diplomat.
Mm.
Um, and I was familiar with him because at a period in high school and then again in college, I had an interest in that sort of the Napoleonic era, and he sort of was clearly this master diplomat of that period. And so the idea like these two brilliant minds were sort of in conflict was interesting, which was a connection that um, I hadn't really seen made anywhere else. That like it was, that was sort of the antagonist that Adams was confronting in with the Monroe Doctrine. Um, so stuff like that, and then again, like South America, which we haven't even really gone into this yet, but South America was waging its war of independence from Spain at this point, which was sort of an outgrowth of the whole Napoleonic Wars, because Napoleon had essentially done like a regime change within Spain, sort of
Mm.
removing the monarch who was there and putting his own brother in power. So that caused a legitimacy crisis, and that's when South America started fighting for its independence. And then how the British were sending weapons to the South Americans, which again was like not really mentioned anywhere, but sort of just researching that kind of came up as a major point. And then it's just sort of like this web of both alliances and backstabbing within this diplomacy of the US wants Florida from Spain. Spain is sort of leaning on Britain for its protection, but at the same time, Britain is sending weapons to South America. And it's like, does Spain know that Britain is doing that? It's like, probably, but they're so weak at this point that like they have like no one else to turn to. So they're
Yeah.
relying on the country who's helping to destroy their empire anyways. And just like those different things, even reading like history books, were not being mentioned cohesively as like a single piece, but just through my research, sort of discovering them and bringing them together in order to build kind of a multi-dimensional uh, situation of what Adams is having to navigate and confront. I thought that was one of the more interesting things to do with this book. And with the Eisenhower book, it was a bit similar. That I mean, it's different in the fact that like I'd been interested in him for so long that like most of the research there wasn't like that new. It was mostly just like looking at sources and being like, all right, what specifically was said. But the idea is the same though, especially with like how he was handling the nuclear situation of the 1950s. Just like looking at um, different sources and different people saying different things, and just sort of bringing it all together and synthesizing it with kind of like a cohesive situation that, in that case, Eisenhower's having to confront. I don't know if that sort of answers what you're asking.
Yeah, I like it. I wish that they in school, in regular primary school or whatever, that they made history a little more fun. I remember in 7th grade thinking I like history class the best, but I don't remember a whole lot of history in high school after middle school. But how do you construct your books? Like, what programs do you use for writing?
I use both Google Chrome a bit, and then just I don't know what you would call it, kind of the Apple Notes that just kind of come on the Mac and phone. Just usually it'll have like just hundreds of bullet points, and that I'll kind of have to like sift through. Just kind of whenever an idea occurs to me or something. Like the notes are like more casual, just like if something occurs to me, just kind of throwing it in there, and then it's like, all right, I'll kind of just dig that out later. But using kind of Google Docs as like the main place of like just various documents of like, all right, this is just like the research document where I'll just kind of like dump whatever information I can find. And then another document that kind of becomes like a character Bible where it's sort of listing out the character traits and sort of being able to describe so like the individual characters. So let's say like Adams or Henry Clay, who's both an enemy and an ally in the book.
Frenemy.
Yeah, I mean they're mostly antagonists, but like kind of the way that there's a major political realignment between a lot of the big players. That's kind of one of the major plot lines in that novel. So like Henry Clay, President Monroe, Adams's wife, and so on. There's usually like 15 or so major characters will get like a large sort of Bible done for them that's a couple pages long, or sometimes more than a couple pages. So I can really just kind of like know the different like dimensions of their personality in order to kind of help portray them as well as I can. So there's those, and then there's just like the overall outline of bringing together just sort of again bullet pointing like, so this is going to be chapter one, scene one. You know, this is the general direction that this is going to go in, and so I can just kind of look at that and pull from that in order to do the rough draft. And then from the rough draft, there's what kind of becomes the final document version, which is, I guess, the second draft, which is, once that's written, we kind of keep polishing it and twerking it, but it doesn't really need to be like written from scratch again after that, because usually by that point, it's kind of like pretty solidified.
Right.
So that's usually how it goes. So it's usually like 5 or 6 major Google Docs in that way, and then just a couple of note sections where I just kind of will throw random ideas in.
Do you find yourself taking notes like at odd times where you either wake up at night or you're in the store doing something and then you're like, man, I bet, like, you see the Quaker oatmeal thing and you think, wow, Adams, wonder what Adams had for breakfast. What was his favorite food? I need a scene about Adams saying, I can't eat these grits. I got to have oats. Do you go into detail like that?
Yeah, so when it comes to like night, I'll usually try to like, because I'm a pretty light sleeper, so I'll try to like not disrupt things too much. Like if something occurs to me, like while I'm, trying to fall asleep, I'll check out, say to myself, like, just do your best to remember this and write it down in the morning. And
Mm.
9 out of 10 times I usually can. So it's not that system usually works.
Wow.
And then yeah, like random times like throughout the day, like I'll just be thinking or whatever. Like there's one time with Adams, actually kind of similar to the example that you just said. I was watching some show or something, and a character was brushing his teeth, and it was just like, how would he do that? What did
Mm.
they use? And searched, and it turns out that they mostly used burnt bread and like soap that they would just kind of mix together, and that was kind of the version of toothpaste that they had at the time. And so that's
Wow.
mentioned early in the book that like I woke up, I brushed my teeth by doing this, and then I went on and did this, and yeah, so it's like stuff like that. It's like little details like that that help to kind of like bring the world and the characters to life. It's just like that is true. How would they have done that at the time?
Yeah.
So things like that.
In his journals, was it, especially towards the younger part of his life, were there things like, dad set me to bed without any oats, and we have this new thing called a fork? I mean, were there any little pieces of history like that?
It's not usually quite like that. Like he does discuss like when steamships are invented, which kind of happens right before when this book is set. Um, like he discusses that a bit, that he like gained interest in like Robert Fulton and that type of thing. He like read a lot about him. Um, there's discussions of when like he's like early on in his diary, so he's like probably 12 or 13, that like that was like during the War for Independence, and so his father took him to Europe and enrolled him in a school in I believe in Paris. It's been a couple of years since I did the initial research for this. Um, I think he was in school in Paris, and the other kids were going ice skating. And he wrote to his dad, who was probably in the Netherlands, negotiating, like, "Hey, Dad, can I have money to buy skates?" And his dad is like, "Sure, you can have money, but like, what's going on in class? Like, tell me, like, what are you learning?" And so just like these kind of conversations between
Wow.
father and son are kind of interesting, and like just the context of everything that's going on at that point.
Do you have, when you're putting these together and you get a section of it done, do you have, whether it's a writing group or some ideal readers or just people you send portions of it to before it's, maybe you got a couple drafts on a part, but not the whole thing done yet? Do you have people that you send it to, one, to keep yourself interested in it because it feels like you're responsible to somebody else, but also to see if the story's tracking and what people think about it, what they find interesting?
So with the rough draft, it's usually like so rough that like
Mm.
I generally don't show that to other people because it's like not even like complete like sentences or paragraphs sometimes. It's just kind of like because like I'm better at like dialogue comes more instinctively to me than like prose does. So like the dialogue will usually be pretty complete and doesn't really need to be changed that much between the drafts, but like the prose needs a lot more work. So like if it's like a paragraph of description or something, I'll kind of like might say like, all right, build a description of the build because he moves houses and offices and stuff. So like this is going to be kind of a couple of the basic details you might want to mention, but like um find a better like build out a better description of this, next time or something. And it's like I'm not really
Mhm.
gonna send that to somebody. So,
Yeah.
but like as far as like the general story though, and the direction that I'm planning, I'll talk to my wife about that or a couple of close friends who are also interested in writing. And I'll say like this is what I'm thinking. How does that sound? And whatever feedback they get, if it kind of seems reasonable, incorporate it or not, kind of depending on whatever makes the most sense. By the second draft, when things are becoming more finalized, um, this time around, actually, kind of guess to take back something I just said a second ago. This time around with Adams, I was in a writing group for a few months, and I showed them one scene that came out pretty decently, even the first time around, where he Monroe and Jefferson and met with former President Jefferson to discuss the Missouri crisis and sort of slavery exploding as this national kind of issue for the first time. And you kind of get to see Jefferson as this elder statesman, and kind of Adams kind of evaluates how Jefferson has evolved in on this issue. But that scene was not like perfect the first time around, but like was solid enough that I felt comfortable sharing it with the group and got their feedback. But um, for the most part, though, I don't really show the first draft around that much. But with the second draft, since it's more kind of finalized or becoming more finalized, I'll sometimes like if especially if there's something I'm like struggling with, which is again is usually something prose related, like in exactly
Mm.
how to word a description or something. I might like just take a picture of it and send it to like one of my writer friends and be like, "All right, do you have any ideas of how to make this better? Because I'm struggling with this." Um, and that's usually kind of the extent of what I'll show to people until the second draft is done. And then once that's done is when I'll kind of like start showing it around and like, to my wife or friends or something and be like, all right, like, just can you just read the full thing and just let me know what you think and anything that you think I should kind of like beef up or polish or anything like that.
How do you develop those ideas for, I guess, the more fictional side of historical fiction, where maybe you have the framework of generally what happened, and then you're trying to make it, I guess it's more exciting, more engaging, more insight into the people's personal lives. How do you develop those ideas?
Well, again, a lot of it are things that like just are not really going to be like available within like a sort of conventional nonfiction book. So like the specific dialogue, like we'll say within like a meeting or something, that like they might like a book will say like Adams met with Monroe and Calhoun and discussed uh, Russia's claim to the Northwest or something, and they discuss like these two or three things. Um, but it's not gonna like really break down specifically like, Adams said this, then Calhoun said this, then President Monroe said, and then Adams said this again, and kind of how that goes on for like a few pages.
Hmm.
So like with the Adams book again, like he has a diary that like will often kind of break down some of the things that were said, but like with Eisenhower, there wasn't anything like that really. So like that was more fictionalization in terms of like, well, these are the general things that were discussed, but like how would that discussion actually kind of play out? Um, and then even more than that would be like sort of the inner thinking of the characters, because I put a lot of focus on like sort of the character arc and trying to make them as multidimensional as possible. Um, and I have a particular interest in, I guess, what you would call like the different layers of how a character uh, thinks and operates, and how those different layers interact with each other. So to kind of put this simply, like my sense is, and I see this in myself, and I think I see this in other people too, that like people will sort of have a conscious level of thinking, which is what they're more immediately saying and things like that. Below that, they'll have like a more like just instinctive thought pattern. That's probably like kind of, I guess, who you would say they are, like kind of deep down, if that makes sense.
Hmm.
And then how those two things interact with each other. Um, So, and the film Lawrence of Arabia is probably my favorite movie, just because I think it portrays this like so well. And I mean, it's spoilers for a movie that's like 6 years old, but like, I don't want to go like too deep into that, but like how he's seeing himself as like this heroic savior of sort of like the Arabic movement, but like as is slowly revealed throughout the film, that like it's more of he has like a affinity for pain, is how I would describe it, both causing it and feeling it,
Oh,
and that's a lot of his motives. And the director of the film, David Lean, in interviews, kind of helped to say like this is what he was going for, and I think most biographers you know say that they think that that's accurate, um, and we have letters of his that pretty much you know confirm that. So like that type of thing. So like for Eisenhower, that was a little simpler because he was just a bit simpler, I think, of a kind of how he operated, where he was very concerned about what we would call like a just like a selfish instinct, that he felt everybody was sort of just like instinctively out for themselves. And
mm,
that his sort of moral framework, kind of what you got from the army, was that like people had a moral duty to sort of restrain that selfishness and consciously override it in order to fulfill a duty to others. Um, so that's like kind
sounds
of
more like a
his.
stoic.
Yeah, it actually was. That's funny you say that, because there's a chapter in that novel which we kind of get into like some like artistic experimentation. That the chapter that deals with D-Day, the Normandy landing,
Hmm.
is it's written in a similar mold as though like it was Marcus Aurelius's Meditations, but it's Eisenhower doing it. So he's like writing like almost like a letter to himself to put kind of like the Cold War in perspective, remembering what D-Day was like, which was so much more stressful because of all the lives that were being put into harm's way. Um, but it's written quite specifically and like openly, like within a similar mold as Marcus Aurelius's Meditations, because I saw like a link between Eisenhower's sort of moral framework around the concept of duty and Marcus Aurelius and Stoicism. So yeah, that's a really good insight.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, so for Eisenhower, a lot of his sort of character arc is him going from event to event, whether it be his rise through the ranks in World War II or just the stresses of the presidency with the nuclear issues, and trying to restrain his inner sort of, selfishness and desires in order to fulfill this moral duty. And so he is like a more positive character arc. Adams is more negative, I think, because one issue we haven't really discussed yet is just the pressures he was under as the eldest son of John and Abigail Adams, who are sort of like the ultimate power couple of the founding
Yeah.
era. And like it's almost comical the amount of pressure they put on him. Like we think of like how a lot of parents will sort of pressure their kids to be successful in their careers or in life or something. This is like that, so it's kind of relatable, but it's like on such a different level of like they basically told him like, we founded this country, so you will become president,
Hmm.
and you have to become a two-term president because John Adams the father lost to Jefferson in his reelection bid, so we want you to become a two-term president. And so this entire period when he's Secretary of State is sort of framed as though he is trying to help establish the United States as the dominant country in North America, both for its own right, but also he thinks that that will make him popular enough if he does that, that the country will then elect him president and he'll kind of fulfill his parents' goals for him. So on the one hand, there's like this extreme ambition that they put upon him, but also they had this obsession with virtue, which again, similar to Marcus Aurelius, but his mother said these things to him. So Abigail Adams said these things to him, like, if you are not the most virtuous person possible, then I'd rather you had just like died in the ocean returning from Europe than live.
Hey, Mom.
And yeah, and so it's like these two like super extreme values of ambition and virtue, which are not, I mean, they don't have like the cleanest overlap. I mean, they can to some extent, but they're not like identical. And so these two things that are sort of placed upon him, and he like so desperately wants to please his parents, even as like an adult, because he's in like his 50s at this point. And just like the tension between these two as he's trying to live up to what his parents want, really informs a lot of his character arc in this novel. And this novel is written in the first person, so it's like directly from his viewpoint.
Okay.
And so not only that, but also, I mean, but you have all of that, but then it's not explicitly said, but it's meant to be inferred, and I'll just kind of say it here for the purpose of this podcast, to kind of go back to what I was talking about with the conscious versus subconscious, is that it seems pretty clear to me that Adams never actually wanted to be a politician. He never wanted to go into law or diplomacy or politics or any of that. His actual interests were in science and poetry. And it was his parents who sort of pushed him into this direction. And so, that career shift that he personally, I think, did not actually want, plus this like, huge pressure upon him. I think those two things, all that together, sort of like distorted his personality because it lasted for so long and was so just heavy. And so he's kind of a grouchy guy. He's not like known as like being like a nice or friendly person. Like Eisenhower is much warmer. And so Adams,
he's a creature of the Beltway.
Yeah, he would fit in well. I don't want to make a strict comparison to somebody like Nixon because I think he had better character than him, but like that type of like sort of grouchy, almost like human porcupine type of person, like that's who kind of was in this period, especially just like he's trying so hard to succeed as Secretary of State, both just to navigate these crises for the country's benefit, but also because he wants to become president to please his parents. And just the different sort of layers of his thought process that are being portrayed that like I think a novel can do in a way that a nonfiction biography may not have the liberty to do. And I think that's something that of why I think historical fiction is so interesting in order to bring that to life. But it's not like it's like completely made out of like whole cloth or something. And so this is like some like you're just completely changing things. I don't want to like name names, but like you can think of like movies that just like completely change whatever happened.
Yeah.
Like I never do stuff like that. It's like if it's like a reasonable inference and it would be interesting, you can kind of like flesh it out though. And so something like that is how I would sort of kind of dramatize whatever the history is, whether it's so like the dialogue within meetings or like the fleshing out the character arcs of some of these historical figures, so like things like that.
How do you deal with the dialogue? Do you put it in like how we would talk today, or do you try to kick it back to the old times?
So Well, with the Eisenhower book, it wasn't that complicated because like they didn't talk like that differently back then, like in the 1940s and 50s.
They just
I
had
mean,
that voice like this. See, they talk like this. See, we're gonna go over here to Europe.
yeah, I mean Eisenhower's voice in particular sounded kind of like I'm trying. The actor's name is slipping from my mind right now, but the main actor, main male actor in Gone with the Wind, I feel like that was a comparison that
Hmm.
was made pretty frequently.
That's not Humphrey
So
Bogart, is it?
it isn't. See,
Okay,
this is something I
just
would
failed that.
normally remember that, but yeah, people can look that up, I guess. And I normally would remember that, but it's just slipping right now. But for Adam, since it is further back in time, I tried again. We talked about like a balancing act. This is kind of another point where it's like a balancing act of trying to both make it sound modern enough that like it's readable and enjoyable for a modern reader, but like it still has like kind of the flavor of that time.
Okay.
Um, and I think like when you either read his diary or just read about that period, at least for me, like I can just kind of absorb some of enough of that flavor
Experience.
that you can kind of like just mix it well with like a more modern dialect. So it's both it feels accurate, but it also is like more accessible. Um,
Have you seen the TV show or the show Outlander?
I have not.
Oh, okay. That's where they talk a little old, but it's also a little modern. They just throw it in every now and then. Usually with mine, if I'm talking about people from the past, then I'll just say the story is translated to modern English, and then boom, I'll go on with it because I don't want to get lost in it. Clark Gable is that guy.
Yeah, that's the actor's name. And yeah, I think that's like I personally think that like a lot of historical fiction is a balancing act, that you're balancing both the history to make it, authentic, but also it is like a work of art intended for a modern audience. And so
Hmm.
I think being able to keep both of those thoughts in your head and try to forge that middle ground, I think is that's how I approach it. I think that's how most of the most successful works within the genre do it.
I wonder how much of actual recorded history is, fiddled with a little to where it's kind of fiction. Like if the winner's right, the history, then how much of it is actually the way it happened? Like you have some
Well,
stuff where it reports and things, and even in those, you gotta go, did anybody put a little spice in here or put a little something that didn't really happen, or just make it look a little better, and then somebody else came along later and made it look a little better, and then a little better and a little better, and next thing you know, Genghis Khan is a great guy that did a lot of things for the world.
I mean, I think since it's like especially around the 1960s or so, historians like as a profession have been pretty conscious of that, and have sort of striven to try to sort of correct for that.
Mm.
Like the project that I'm working on currently, which I've just started researching, started about a month ago, which is about this German academic who helped to design a lot of Nazi Germany's foreign policy and helped to mentor both Hitler and Rudolf Hess. So he's basically like a villain protagonist. Um, he was interrogated at the Nuremberg Tribunal after the war, and it's pretty clear that like Robert Jackson, who was the lead prosecutor, and his team made assertions within those documents that even to somebody like this are probably not entirely fair. Um,
Mm.
like asserting that he had a larger role than he did. Um, which again then leads to like different branches of thought over like what did this person actually do, and then you can use historical fiction to try to like bridge the gaps in ways that are both reasonably authentic but also would be interesting. And then in the author's note you can kind of like break down specifically like this is what I found and this is why I approached it this way. So but I think like for the most part though, like most historians, especially like mainstream historians, will try to like uh you know they're aware that like history is written by the victors, as kind of as like
Yeah.
the cliche goes, and try to you know look at different perspectives or speculate. um I mean there are some historians, um especially more toward I guess the the extreme endpoints, that would almost exclusively try to look at, quote, the losers' perspectives, like somebody like Howard Zinn, who was,
Mm.
pretty critical of most of sort of mainstream American history, sort of said that like when he wrote a lot of his work, he was specifically looking at, you know, what was the Native American perspective, what was, the perspective of let's say like Mexico and the Mexican American War, and exclusively looking at that side.
Yeah.
And I think that's been sort of part of the tradition within the historical field for, I mean, 50 or 60 years now.
Yeah, the pliability of history is really something, and I think that's why you see a big push for like the Holocaust museums, and those is because that group doesn't want people to forget how bad that was. But I think even given current events now, it's kind of surprising to see how much people have forgotten that, and then how much it seems like there's so many people on the other side, and you're like, oh wow, I didn't realize we would have this much protesting about this in the streets. And I mean, you got to keep the whatever the narrative is, whatever your telling of history is, alive, because 100 years from now nobody's going to remember it other than what they read, and then they're probably going to repeat the same things over again. But having the diaries of people, even if they're just regular people, I think that's maybe just as valuable as the popular history of, the narrative of what happened written by whoever wrote it. That you get that little taste of, oh, this is the normal life that these people dealt with in this time period. And nobody alive now knows what it was like 200 years ago, so how can you're just drawing inferences off of it anyway of what other people said.
Yeah, I think a few historians have said that, like, for a normal person, if they want to kind of become sort of quote, part of history, that like the way to do it is to basically to keep a diary, like not even of like their own life necessarily, but just like what's and not like of like his world historical events because historians will kind of know that for the most part, but like, this is what like life is like. This is what
Hmm.
things cost. This is what the type of things we're doing, and then I guess leave that in your will to like some sort of local historical society, and that would be a way to sort of both for an average person to sort of enter the historical record, and for the historical record to be more holistic.
Yeah. How do you think that your professional life and education affects your writing?
Well, so, I mean, I've had such a strong interest in history for so long now, since I was, 15, that I think a lot of the sort of decisions I've made um, are influenced by that, both in terms of, the college that I went to, majoring in history, going to law school, and sort of concentrating on national security law. Um, that, those decisions were influenced by that interest. And then in turn, when it comes to like writing historical fiction, the things picked up along the way from, those schoolings and the things I was reading during those schoolings are able to be brought back into it. So like um these books don't deal as much. I mean, they touch on law, but not like they're not like legal novels. I'll probably get to that eventually. But like when Adams is talking with his staff in the State Department that like France does not want to have to pay restitution because Napoleon was like seizing American ships during the war, and he's not in power anymore. There's a new government in power, that he's able to cite um, books of international law that I was familiar with because just learning about them in law school, and say like look at the author named Grotius, that he wrote a lot. He kind of established a lot of modern international law, and the text that he was working with and stuff like that. So like that, I guess that would be kind of one example of how my sort of background and education are used within the writing.
Do you see a recurring theme that goes through your writing from book to book, whether it's, I know it's about different topics, but do you see like a common thread that goes through it?
Well, there's a couple ways of looking at that, I guess. Because on the one hand, I think just topically, so far at least, and probably won't probably stay this way forever. I deal a lot with like international relations and strategic thinking and that type of thing. So like John Quincy Adams as Secretary of State is obviously directing American foreign policy in that period. Eisenhower, both as general and president, is dealing with the international situation of the 40s and 50s, and trying to find elements of that that are both interesting but like are not as well known. Like I don't think either the Monroe era or the Eisenhower era, like they're both kind of seen as like these kind of stable, peaceful points in history, and just sort of
Mhm.
showing like they really weren't. There were a lot of really big crises going on, and it's the fact that these people were there who like really kind of knew what they were doing is the fact that they're seen as like stable. Um, Especially with Eisenhower in the 50s, it was like the so early in the nuclear age that it was like extremely dangerous. But so like I mean, topically, I've been dealing with those things so far. Um, Thematically, like speaking of kind of like from a literary standpoint, I think both. I think self knowledge tends to be a pretty major theme. I mean, we were discussing both with Eisenhower and with Adams, sort of their grasps of, or in Adams' case, kind of lack of grasp of sort of what was going on deeper down within his own mind, and how that
Mm.
affects sort of their emotions, how they function, how they will make decisions, everything like that. Like that's a topic that like I think first kind of seeing that how that plays out within myself, but then being able to sort of flesh that out within historical figures and characters, I think is probably the main theme. So like the that kind of goes through all the novels. So that type of either self knowledge or lack of self knowledge, and how that will affect a person. And again, I think like a film like Lawrence of Arabia portrays that uh, better and more directly than most other uh, works of kind of modern storytelling.
Okay. I know you have a specific time, so I won't keep you much longer. Maybe next time, if we talk again in the future, we can talk more about the podcasting, because I think that is worth going to check out. And those links will be in the show notes for people that are interested in it. That you have that podcast that talks about historical film and books. So something to look forward to. And I wonder if you end up sometimes just in regular life where you're at work or doing whatever, and you start to think to yourself, I, I bet Adams would say this in the situation. And like, it'd be interesting to have, maybe just as a writing exercise, have Adams and Eisenhower talking about something. It's since you know so much about them, just getting to know that character's personality through writing about them, that I bet it's pretty close to what they were like in reality.
Yeah, I mean, I think with Eisenhower especially because I was interested in him for so long that like I would frequently think like, well, what would he think of this? What would he how would he operate? And then if ever I would like try to do that, usually it didn't go super well because it's like it's so kind of like old fashioned compared to like our time that like just it comes off awkwardly.
Yeah.
So I don't actually have a scene of Adams and Eisenhower talking, but within the Eisenhower novel there is a scene that again talking about like dramatization and fictionalization, um, where when he's deciding whether to run for president or not in 1952, there's a scene where in his dream he meets George Washington, who's like his personal hero, like his biggest hero, and I think it's the longest scene in that book where he explains to Washington everything that's happened from like Washington's era through the 1950 or to like around 1950.
Yeah, you
And
got to catch him up. Yeah.
yeah, and so like and so you get Washington's commentary about like the Civil War and modern, like, sort of industrialization and everything like that, and then the world wars and nuclear weapons, which he describes as terrifying. Um, and then it also just shows sort of the links that I see between Washington and Eisenhower. I mean, they're both, these general presidents, but even just like the policies that they pursued and enacted, I basically see Eisenhower as sort of a more modern global update of what Washington was trying to do back in the 1790s as president. And that scene
Sure.
helps to sort of show that link. And Washington kind of says, because if duty's the main theme of the novel, he kind of says, with these new weapons that you're describing, and this isn't the exact line, but like, it sounds like you have a duty to try to stop this and to do something about this. And so, like, that's not like what determines Ike's decision, but like it helps to influence his thinking about running for president.
Yeah. And here I thought it gives a better dimension to historical fiction than just Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure, although a worthwhile movie to see. All right. What's the best way for people to see what you're writing and follow you on social media?
Yeah, so the two best places are, I have an author website that's pretty new actually. It came out like a couple months ago at mbzucker.com. So that should be pretty
Okay.
simple. I have a blog there that I try to update every week or two, and also something called I designed in college called the Eisenhower Encyclopedia, which is just everything that I know about him. So that's a pretty big, just a nonfiction kind of fact center if you have any interest in Eisenhower, for either
Nice.
his generalship or presidency or whatever else. So that's one good source to, if you're interested in following me. And then the other one is on, I still call it Twitter. I know it's technically X now, but
Hmm.
it's at Michael Zucker 1.
Okay. All right. I'll have those in the show notes too. So if people are listening or watching, they can just scroll down and find those direct links. I appreciate your time. It definitely makes history more exciting. Like now I feel like I got to learn more now, get more perspective, especially since we're farther back from things. Maybe we can get a better view. I don't know. You might lose things, but I think you gain things too from that farther back perspective. But
Yeah,
thank
I
you
mean, I
very
think
much.
that, yeah. Oh, thank you. And
Go,
yeah, I think
no,
the context can only ever, whether it's as relevant or not, I guess is debatable. But I think it's always like, it always helps to inform, kind of what's going on in the world and how things have played out in the past.
yeah. All right. Well, I appreciate your time. I'll talk to you on the other side of this. All right.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Thank you.